back to Opera La Moda, the place where fashion, opera, and identity intersect. My name's Francesca Federico, and I'm an opera singer who used to work in the fashion industry. I'm so sorry that I had to take a brief hiatus. There was a lot of stuff going on, a couple auditions, recordings, all that boring opera singer stuff, but I'm back now and I'm ready to give you some content, particularly this video that I've been looking forward to filming for quite some time. So today on Opera La Moda, I am going to be rating old opera album covers from the 1960s and 70s. And the reason I chose this time period is because I think enough time has passed that even if I hate the albums, people can't get too mad at me about them. I mean, ultimately they're dated for a reason, but that's fine, you know. B, because fashion and visuals from the 60s and 70s are really fun and iconic. And C, because I used to work in classical music PR, and part of our job was looking at album covers that labels or artists would produce, and we would have to kind of like vote and discuss which ones were the best for the release. And it was a really fun part of the job, and some classical musicians come up with some really crazy stuff, so you kind of learn to have an eye towards what to look for, what makes for a good album cover, what makes for a bad one, etc. So needless to say, I love doing this kind of stuff. When I'm doing these ratings, just as a disclaimer, I'm not making a commentary on the singer or the music of the album itself. I am solely focusing on the visuals of the album, and in fact, all of the albums that I'm going to be looking at today are from artists that I really enjoy. Before we get started, let's briefly talk about what I think makes a quote-unquote good opera album. I'm going to be taking a look at two modern opera album covers and telling you why I like them. Number 1, this is mezzo-soprano Elena Garancia's Revive album, which was released in 2016. I really like this album cover because it explains a lot about the singer, but yet isn't busy or cheesy. You can tell that it's a solo singer's album, and it's photographed in kind of a mysterious and dramatic way with a lot of rich tones like these blues and these reds. You can see that this person is not only an opera singer, but probably someone who specializes in more dramatic repertoire rather than maybe a lighter voiced singer like a soubrette soprano who would mostly be focusing on like the roles of young women or even teenagers. This is someone who is singing women's roles, women who have been through struggles and love and heartbreak, things like that. I also really like the fact that there's a little bit of a mystery in the fact that Garancia is not staring straight at the camera, but yet looking off to the side. It's almost like she's embodying an opera character already on the album, although it's sort of left untold as to which character it might be. And overall, if I saw this album cover, it would definitely make me intrigued to listen to the singer if I didn't already know her. Number 2 is Jakub Józef Orliński's cover for his upcoming album Anima Eterna, which will be released later this year, I believe. This is such a cool cover. I love this because you can't immediately clock it as a classical music album. It is really artistic and avant-garde in a way that most classical music albums usually aren't. There's something both sensual and intense about it, and also calls to mind mythology, transformation, something otherworldly, something that's growing and kind of morphing. I honestly can't wait to hear this album when it comes out, in part because you can tell that Orliński is an artist who takes a lot of risks artistically, right? So overall, I really, really like this album cover, and I think this would be a really smart direction for artists to kind of be going, especially ones who specialize in classical music, because I think it speaks to a broader audience and it's not something that's fussy or staid or old-fashioned. So the album opera covers of the past were generally not so dramatic or artistic. They would generally be pretty straightforward. For a solo artist, for example, you'd usually have either a picture of them smiling on the cover or maybe a small picture of them dressed in the costume of a particular opera, and then you just sort of have a lot of information about, you know, who the conductor was, where it was recorded, these kind of things. Here are two examples, one by Elizabeth Schwarzkopf and one by Janet Baker, that come from around this time period, 70s, 80s, things like that. It's kind of a shame because we know that in the 60s and 70s there were so many albums coming out where the album art really did kind of push the envelope and go into kind of an experimental experimental direction, but we don't really see this so much with the classical music album covers of the time. The album covers that I'm going to be looking at do kind of push the envelope in one way or another, or are kind of incongruous in some way. You know, they give us an idea of the artist and they're sort of interesting time capsules of the era. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to be going in chronological order to kind of show the progression of this art from the mid-1960s to the mid to late 1970s. I'm also going to be giving each album a rating from 1 to 5 standing ovations. So the things I'm going to be looking for are, does it make you want to listen to the album? What does it tell you about the artist? Is it doing anything interesting in terms of the album art or design? Yeah, so let's see what we've got. The first album I want to look at is Italian baritone Ettore Bastianini's Live from Tokyo album in 1965. This might seem like a little bit of a weird choice, but I find this album cover so interesting and so different from many of the opera albums of this time period. The first thing I notice is it's so casual in comparison to these other covers where the singer is usually in costume or wearing a suit at the very least. This one really reminds me of a folk music album, like something from Bob Dylan or like Woody Guthrie or something. I don't know, I find this to be a really evocative cover. I love how simple it is. I love the way he's dressed, and I do think I would want to listen. And as a plus, Bastianini's voice is just heavenly. So I give this cover 4 standing ovations. I bet you didn't expect that. The second album is from American soprano Felicia Weathers' album Verdi and Puccini Arias of 1967. I absolutely love this cover. I love this cover. First of all, the look is a look, okay? We have this gorgeous baby pink empire waist dress, very Regency era, but also sort of very 60s, sort of very Valley of the Dolls-esque. The crystal beading around the bust actually looks super modern. It reminds me of the Design House area and some of the looks from Ariana Grande's recent album even. The colors are sort of dusty and also high contrast, which really evokes the 1960s. Overall, I think this is a really cool look and very modern and different for the time period. I could imagine this cover working for an album of several different genres. And so brava, I give this album 5 out of 5 standing ovations. The third album is also from 1967. It is Puccini's Tosca, a cast recording featuring an absolute superstar cast. You have Birgit Nilsson, you have Franco Corelli, you have Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. I mean, it's just incredible. Listen to this album if you can, it's gorgeous. The album cover, however, I'm not feeling it, and I'll tell you why. I actually will say that the part I like the best is the font of the word Tosca. It really places it in the 1960s, even if I didn't already know the year this album was recorded. It's this pop art psychedelic font that was really reminiscent of the era. The roots of this kind of typography actually date back to the Art Nouveau period of the late 19th century, combined with a dash of surrealism. And if you want to know more about that, there's actually a really interesting Vox video, which is where I found out about this kind of typeface initially. You should go watch that to learn more. But anyway, I think that the font is actually too cool for this album cover, which is for me very sort of both stuffy and a little bit cheap looking. I find that Nelson's outfit and her pose and everything kind of remind me of those like murder mystery themed dinners where everyone has to have like a long cigarette or like pretend to be smoking a pipe and you like figure out who murdered someone. I'm also really not a fan of this extreme shadow thing where her hair is blending into the black background, because if you look at it from far away, it kind of looks like she's bald. So in this case, I'm only giving the cover 2 standing ovations out of 5. I'm sure that people bought this album regardless of the relative cheesiness of the cover. We are now jumping ahead to 1975 and this album by Dame Janet Baker of Gluck Arias. So I actually showed you guys a cover by Janet Baker earlier in the video, and it was a much simpler cover. It was just a photo of her smiling, and in comparison to that cover, I like this one a lot better. I think the fur coat is kind of fabulous, and her expression is a lot more relaxed. She seems really sure of herself. She's clearly a diva. She knows exactly what she's doing. Overall, I think this cover has a really nice mood to it, but my issue is that it seems very much at odds with the actual repertoire of the album itself. So, if you don't know, Christoph Gluck was a composer from the early classical period, meaning the early to mid 18th century. So, as you can hear from this recording, the music has this gorgeous silvery quality to it, but it's very proper, and you can tell it's from several hundred years ago. And for me, I feel like she's sort of dressed like a soul music diva on this, like an Aretha Franklin or Minnie Riperton or something. There's actually a really beautiful Minnie Riperton album cover that I found for her album Come to My Garden that I think could have actually worked better for this album cover than the fur coat look. I think this dress is beautiful. It feels very fresh, but also very classical. Still current for the time period. I would have loved it if the Janet Baker album had looked like this instead. So I'll give this one 3 standing ovations because it has a good vibe, but overall she should have looked to Minnie Riperton for maybe the aesthetics of the album cover choices. So this next album cover is from a French coloratura soprano that I had actually never heard of, who is named Mady Misplay. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She was really big in France in the 1970s. It seems that from my very cursory research of her, she was a little bit underrated in parts of the world other than in France, so maybe I'm not the only one who is just introducing myself, but she's a beautiful singer, obviously. Anyway, this review's not about her voice. It's about this totally batshit album cover that I absolutely love so much. So, first of all, you can immediately clock that this is from the 70s. It's so deliciously 70s, very groovy, and these sort of muddy colors, like this dull purple, the browns, and the yellows that were really popular in the 70s. Just ask my mom, she has a lot of trauma from that time period. In terms of the color, fashion, and interior design choices of the period. I think this cover overall has so much more imagination and scope to it than the majority of other opera covers I've seen probably ever. And you have in the background what I can only imagine is Romeo and Juliet, which makes sense because we can see from the list of operas that I Capuletti e Montecchi is included there. It's all very romantic and lush, and I also think it's kind of funny how the illustration of Misplay herself, how her hand is on her chin, like she's sort of reminiscing about all these romantic love stories. Anyway, I would give this album a 5 out of 5 standing ovations because it's really fun, it's colorful, it's out of the box, and it makes me smile. For our last album cover, let's head to Montreal, which is the location for this album's setting. It is Luciano Pavarotti's recital program recorded in Montreal at the Place des Arts in September of 1977. Again, this album cover makes me smile. I think you understand everything very clearly about the genre, about Pavarotti himself, and about what to expect from the album. It's going to be big, generous, rich, and effusive in its emotions, which are all very lovely things. I'm very into the vintage car Pavarotti is sort of hanging out of. The whole look with the sepia tone of the photograph is more reminiscent of the 1940s, which is kind of cool. Although it looks like he's giving out the flowers, I think the implication is that his fans are showering him with bouquets of flowers. It's very diva-esque in the best way, even if it's not particularly progressive or modern for the 1970s. It's more of a recollection towards the past, right? And so I would give this album cover 4 out of 5 standing ovations because it's quintessentially Pavarotti. I like how they kind of took a risk with making it look a little bit vintage, and it explains a lot about the album and most certainly makes you want to listen to it. So that's all for my ratings of opera album covers from the 1960s and 70s, and I really hope that you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed making it and doing research for it. Thank you again so much for bearing with me through this time that is getting a little bit busier. I don't know if I can commit to putting out a video every single week, but rest assured, if you subscribe to the channel, you will be the first to know when any new video drops. And also make sure to follow me on Instagram at Opera La Moda, where you can see some fun behind the scenes looks at the interaction of fashion and opera, as well as little hints and previews in advance of each YouTube video. Hugs, kisses, and goodbye for now.